Dr. Afary is the Mellichamp Chair in Global Religion and Modernity and Professor of Religious Studies at the University of California at Santa Barbara. But today I'm not going to tell you about Janet's accomplishments and accolades, because she does not need that kind of introduction. Everybody already knows her and her scholarship, or should know her. I would, however, like to tell you about a connection that was born a decade ago. Let me take you back to 2008, spring of 2008, when I got a letter of admission into the Comparative Literature PhD program at the UCSB. Well, that was one of the best days of my life. I had been in the US for only a year and a half, and my dream was coming true. In the summer of the same year, I paid a visit to the campus. Every single faculty member and student I met told me about this new faculty hire, Janet Afary, who would be the best mentor for me. The program was obviously trying to convince me to accept this admission, but of course they didn't have to. I started the program the fall of that year, fall 2008. But Janet was on a research fellowship at the UCLA. So I had to wait until the fellowship she was done with the fellowship, and she joined UCSB for the following year. And the following year, the very first semester, she offered classes. I jumped on it, winter of 2010. Guess what the course was? One that changed my entire academic perspective and research agenda and direction forever: gender in the Middle East. It was in Janet's graduate seminar a decade ago that not only the idea for my second book on temporary marriage was born, but also the idea for this symposium emerged and evolved through our multiple discussions later. Since 2010, Janet and I have collaborated on more than a dozen projects, and I have never had a better teammate, mentor, and a friend. Some of these projects include a conference at the NYU Abu Dhabi that we co-organized in 2017, and a book series for Bloomsbury that we co-edit. She has taught me how to navigate academia as a woman of color, as a junior scholar, but most importantly, as a compassionate human. This is the one that I value most, more than ever, especially now. We need more compassionate humans, not only in academia, but in the world. So the world is a better place thanks to people like Janet, who teach and mentor the future scholars of their respective fields. Sharing the gift of her time, knowledge, and expertise, Janet's vision and sincerity have deeply inspired me. It has been a great privilege and honor to work under her guidance and with her, but it has been a more humbling experience to be able to call her a friend. All this to say that besides her brilliant scholarship, Janet is just a fascinating human, and we are all in for a treat today. Today, Janet's talk, which is based on collaborative research with Professor Roger Friedland, is titled Growing Popularity of Non-Standard Marriages and Unions in Iran and Southwest Asia, North Africa. In 2017-2018, Janet and Roger used Facebook banner ads in 7 Muslim-majority countries to survey the young and computer literate populations of Algeria, Egypt, Iran, Pakistan, Palestine, Tunisia, and Turkey, as well as those living in the diaspora. This talk looks at a cross-section of those who took the survey and either expressed their attitudes about non-standard marriages in the region and or admitted that they were currently living in such a union rather than in a formal marriage. Please don't forget to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to post your questions for Janet, and I will try to ask as many of your questions as possible from her. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Janet Afary.
Thank you very much, Claudia, for that incredibly kind introduction. It has truly been a pleasure seeing you grow and working with you all these years. I want to thank UNC's Persian Studies program for their kind invitation to speak. Before speaking, I want to take a minute to remember Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, an inspiration to all of us, a model of authenticity, dignity, and a voice for human justice. There is going to be a great deal of speculation about what will happen to the Supreme Court in the next few weeks and months, but I don't want to dwell on that. What I want to talk about is that in the world in which millions of women are deprived the opportunity to ever reach their full potential, what happens when one does, a brilliant woman like her? She had a lot of things against her. She was a child of an immigrant family, a Russian Jewish immigrant family, a girl, of course, a woman. And at the time she finished Harvard Law School as one of the top students, also a mother. And so there were like several strikes against her. She couldn't get a job at 40-something law firms that she applied to, and ended up with a teaching career, which she later decided was actually the best thing that happened to her. Now, we do remember her for her 5 landmark decisions in which she argued to the court, and successfully argued, that the 14th Amendment, which provides equal protection, does not just apply to racial discrimination, but also to sex discrimination. But I also want to remind everyone that her goal was really to free both men and women from the roles that society had assigned them. In other words, until this time, your sex defines essentially what profession you went into, and the law was backing that. And she made some arguments, such as the fact that a man can be a very good nurse and has a right to go to nursing school, and thereby opened up so many potentialities out there in the world. And I want to think about that as we discuss the lives of millions of women who are either set themselves a much limited perspective in life, or they are denied such an opportunity by their family and sometimes by their spouse. Okay, so I'm going to share screen here and hopefully we'll start. Now, in recent years, there has been a significant change in union formations in the Middle East, North Africa, and Pakistan, a region that more recently has been called Southwest Asia and North Africa, or SWANA. The age of first marriage for both men and women has gone up, while rates of marriage has been declining. At the same time, various researchers are reporting a significant increase in the rates of non-standard marriages in the region. Because such marriages are not registered, it has been extremely difficult to document this trend. Now, what are the different kinds of non-standard marriage in the region historically? Historically, there have been 3 types of non-standard marriages. There is mut'a, which is a religiously sanctioned institution of Shiism. It's practiced in communities such as Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Syria, and Lebanon, among its, of course, Shia community. It's an arrangement whereby a woman enters into a contract for exclusive sex with a man on her part for a definite period of time and for a stipulated sum. Historically, these unions have been more between affluent older men who take a much younger mut'a wife from a poorer family as a second wife, and often when the men were away from home. The second kind of non-traditional marriage in the region is an Urfi. Urfi, you can think of it as customary marriage or common law marriage, which is practiced in the Sunni world. So this has historically not been a religiously sanctioned marriage, and has also had historically no state recognition. However, after the Iranian Revolution of 1979, when the Islamic Republic of Iran encouraged the practice of temporary marriage in the Shi'i world, the Sunni clerics and Islamists decided to follow basically the model of Iran. And they decided to make the institution of Urfi more legitimate. So they started issuing fatwas that legitimated the practice of Urfi through the Middle East. As a result, Urfi unions are now assumed to have religious blessing, making them different from simple cohabitation, which is still regarded as immoral by the public. A third form of non-traditional relationship is called misyar, or traveling marriage. You can think of misyar as a Sunni version of mut'a, or if I didn't mention it earlier, the word mut'a in Iran is known as sighe. It's the same concept, same word. So misyar is a Sunni version of mut'a in that it's a religiously sanctioned marriage, but without the termination clause of mut'a. So when you enter a mut'a, you state when it's going to end, and it's of course religiously recognized. When you enter a misyar, you don't state when it's going to end. It is a practice used to be exclusive to Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, but gradually grew in popularity in other Sunni countries through migrant workers who lived and worked in the Persian Gulf areas and away from their former wives in their homeland. So when they came to work in the Persian Gulf area, they entered into these misyar relationships, and then they sort of learned about this and took it back home. We also see it happening more recently as part of essentially sex tourism. So this is the sex tourism of more wealthy men from the Gulf region traveling to countries like Egypt and elsewhere and practicing it over there. Now, we have excluded certain types of unions or relationships, I should say, from our study. Our focus has been on two consenting adults, individuals, who want to engage in a legal sexual relationship, but they don't have the financial means, or for any other reason, they don't want to enter into a long-term formal relationship. And so we've excluded three categories of relationships. One of them is the misyar traveling marriage. This is essentially what I call sex tourism, where it's between a wealthy man and an underage girl. And as I said, it's mostly between members of the Gulf Cooperation Council. These are Arab states of the Persian Gulf: Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, and poor girls in Egypt and elsewhere. So we've actually excluded that from our study. The second time we've excluded are polygamous relationships. Here is where a man is simultaneously in a formal marriage and also has a temporary wife. And the third type of relationship we've excluded are adult sex workers, female sex workers, who enter into a union, which they call a temporary marriage, but in fact, it's just a cover for sex work. So those are the categories that we've excluded. Now, what are some of the reasons for the increase in non-traditional unions? Multiple reasons. There has been a general delay in the age of first marriage. Many men and women are now postponing marriage until their late 20s and 30s, when they have completed college, have worked for a few years, and therefore are more financially secure. Women who pursue advanced studies particularly face a dilemma, because by the time they have a job, they may actually be considered not suitable or too old for a formal marriage. That means a marriage with someone who is of equal or higher social status with them. There are other reasons why the tradition has grown dramatically in recent years: wars in the region, migration, particularly of younger men, high unemployment rate in the region, the expenses that are traditionally associated with marriage, buying wedding gifts of jewelry, securing a domicile, promise of mahriya in case of divorce. All of these have increased financial pressure on men who simply cannot meet these demands. There's also the outrageously expenses of large weddings that makes it impossible for a young couple to marry without the aid of family or loans. And this is something that the family sees as essential, basically, to face safe in the community. And so as a result, in the Gulf Cooperation Council and Egypt, we see many highly educated women who are reluctantly marrying less educated men in misyar or Urfi unions as a way of avoiding the social stigma of being unmarried. In contemporary Iran, we have the same situation. Divorce rates peaked at 21% in 2014. Rates of formal marriage have continued to decline. Sighe or mut'a has also changed in Iran, even among the more religious classes. So now we have people entering into these sighe unions who are closer in age, usually in their 30s and 40s. The union has a longer duration, a mean of about a decade or more, and is viewed as an option for both previously married men and women, who about 30% of people who in our sample entered such unions, and never married men and women, 60%. And the latter is a major breach with tradition, because the idea of a woman from an upper middle class woman entering a temporary marriage was something that was unheard of. She would have not agreed to do something like that before. What we see in the more secular sector of society is that people are simply opting for cohabitation, which is commonly referred to as white marriage, despite all the legal prohibitions against such marriages in the Islamic Republic. And why are these unions called white? It's because there's no contract, and hence the page on the identification booklet in which one's marital status is noted is left blank. White marriage and the evolving nature of sexual relationships in Iran is the subject of a book Jeslyn Faust and I are publishing called Iranian Romance in the Digital Age, if I can put a plug for that, coming out with Bloomsbury in February of 2021. Now, in 2012-2018, we placed Facebook banner ads in 7 Muslim majority countries. Our goal was to survey the young and computer literate populations of these societies. The countries that we surveyed were Algeria, Egypt, Iran, Pakistan, Palestine, Tunisia, and Turkey, as well as members of these communities who were living in the diaspora. We received about 30,000 full responses to our survey. Survey takers took the survey in Arabic, Turkish, Persian, and Urdu. We had our grad students at UCSB translate the survey into these languages. Almost all, I would say 98% of our respondents were Muslims. They were Sunnis and Shiites. They were between the ages of 18 and 41. And I would say most of them were from religious classes. And we can say this based on their understanding of their religious value, which is a whole other survey, and we've published on that separately. They came from a wide range of social backgrounds. They were professionals and highly educated individuals, but they were also people with little education and manual workers. Now, this is by no means a representative sample of the overall population of these countries, but it does gauge the attitude of Facebook users, an important electronic public that are engaged with the larger world. So just a very preliminary look at our results with regard to non-traditional marriages. Over 10,000 Muslim respondents provided information about their marital status for us. Of these, 3,500 were formally married, and 450 said that they were in non-standard unions. So about 11% of the total married respondents, both formal and temporary, were in a non-standard marriage. We wanted to know if there was a correlation in marital status and attitudes about the union. Is there one, for example? And we found that 65% of the men who engaged in non-standard marriages had never been formally married, compared to 47% of the women who had never been formally married. So there's an 18% difference, as you see here. More women have actually been married before they agreed to enter into a non-traditional marriage. And 38% of the women were divorced, separated, or they were widowed. We wanted to know if there is a gender divide. Our assumption was that women would be more opposed or conflicted because the union offers very little protection to women, actually, in the course of the union. And the result was that, yes, there is a clear gender divide. A majority of those who took our survey believe that non-standard marriages should be outlawed. However, we realized that women were far more likely to think so. Close to half of the women who took our survey wanted to make such unions illegal, as opposed to 32% of the men only. It's also the case that about 1/3 of the men and women are uncertain about whether the union should be legal or illegal. So if we add the proportion of the women who believe it should be made legal to the ones who are unsure about it, there's still a strong popular basis for its legalization, a basis that would explain why so many Sunni respondents engage in Urfi marriages. This is one of the tables on gender divide in our whole sample. If you look at it, you see that about 40% of those who took the survey believe that the practice should be made illegal. But if you look at the breakdown, you see that almost 50% of the women in our survey believe that it should be made illegal, compared to close to 33% of the men in our survey. And if you look at the bottom, not sure, you'll see that the percentage is pretty high, 32, 35%, an average of 33% of our respondents are not quite sure what is to be done with the institution. In Iran, if you look at the gender divides, the difference is even more marked. If you look at the category, you look at, we coded women as 1 and men as 0 to break with tradition again here. So if you look at it, you see that 56% of women thought that the tradition should be made illegal, and something like 8.649% thought that it should remain legal. In addition, if you look at the chart, you see that about 1/3 of Iranians, again, 28%, 27%, were not sure whether it should be legal or it should be illegal in our sample. Now, the other assumption we wanted to decide was whether it's the old tradition. In the traditional unions of non-standard marriages, we have women entering these unions because they need financial support. So we wanted to know if this is the case. And we found out, much to our surprise, that women are not entering these unions out of financial desperation. Only 5% of the women in our sample relied on their partner for financial support. In fact, 14% of the women in our sample were helping to support their male partners. A large majority of the women who were in these unions were actually employed. But what's interesting is that even wives in formal marriage were far more independent. So 44% of the wives in our sample in both types of marriage were employed. So that suggests that the traditional gender division of labor in marriage is breaking down, both in formal marriage, but also particularly in these non-standard marriages, which historically used to be an institution where women entered simply out of financial desperation. We wanted to know if there's continues to be a sectarian divide. So Sunnism, historically, this is one of actually temporary marriage, mut'a, is one of the big distinctions, major distinctions between Shiism and Sunnism. So Sunnism has historically disapproved of non-standard marriages. This is actually one of the pillars of Sunnism, where Shiism has historically approved of non-standard marriages. Again, it's one of the pillars of Shiism. And what we saw was that, yes, of course, the percentages reflected these earlier religious beliefs. So 42% of the Sunni respondents said it should be made illegal. Note that it's 42% and not, for example, a much higher percentage, not even a majority, whereas in fact, our Sunni respondents, we would expect them to be saying that it should be made illegal. And 22% of the Shia respondents believe it should be made illegal. Again, this is something that we believe Shias should overwhelmingly support it, and yet you still have about 1/5 who believe it shouldn't be. We also saw a correlation. The Sunnis, the more pious they were, the more they opposed Urfi, customary marriage. The Shias, the more pious they were, the more they supported Sigher. Among our Sunni takers in the next table, you'll see twice as many did not support the practice. So that's 42% to 18% who didn't support it. However, among our Shia takers, support for temporary marriage is low based on historical patterns. So if you look at the chart here, and the first column represents Sunnis and the second column represents Shiites. And if you see in the category of should it remain legal, the Sunnis are about 18% and the Shiites are 30%. So these are people from the Shiite community, and you would expect them to want this tradition to be considered legal because it's legal in their religion. And yet you only have like 30% who want it legal. And then when you look at category of unsure, you see again, something between 30 to 34% for Sunnis and 30% for Shiites. So this is a major issue in these communities. People are operating basically outside what you would expect them to operate. Now, the case of Pakistan and Turkey is really interesting because Pakistan and Turkey are anomalies in our survey. Generally, we have more men who are supportive of the tradition, regardless of which country they're in. And yet, a majority of men in all the countries that we surveyed believe that the tradition should be made illegal. But in Pakistan and Turkey, that's not the case. More men want the practice to be made legal rather than illegal. The other interesting observation is that among Sunni Pakistanis, 50 to 60% of men and women are unsure about the practice. This is a huge percentage in these countries, essentially over a majority. And then when you look at Turkey, you see that we actually have a gender war in Turkey with over 61% of women opposed to such unions versus 30% of men. So here again is the chart. On the left is Pakistan. If you look at category of unsure, you'll see out of a total sample of about 1,400, a little more than 1,400, 55% of men and 63% of women were unsure about whether it should be legal or illegal. And if you look at the right table for Turkey, out of about 746 people who responded, you'll see that 30%, almost 30% of the men believe that it should be illegal, whereas 61% of women, so whopping twice as many, who want it to be made illegal. Now, we wanted to know if these unions are loving. Is it just simply a transactional relationship for sex and essentially no emotional investment? And we found that that wasn't the case. Non-standard marriages are loving union. They're not cold transactional relations. Majority of men, 60%, and women, 53%, said that they love their partner. By the way, these numbers are very close to what we have for couples in formal marriages. So in terms of declaring one's love for one's partner, we don't really see a major difference. Where we see a difference is between standard and non-standard marriages is about the reciprocity of this love. So the men essentially are much likely than women to think that their partner in their lives, whether in standard or non-standard marriages, did not love them. So in fact, when we would compare actually the standards of percentage of women who would say that they love their partner to what the men thought, it was really quite glaring. The love gap was dramatic in the case of non-standard marriage. In other words, 34% of men believed that their partner in a non-standard marriage did not love them. But only 17% of men in standard marriages believe their partner did not love them. So men are more sure, essentially, of the love of their partner when they are in a standard marriage than when they are in a non-standard marriage. What does that love mean, really? And does it mean sharing intimate thoughts? And that turned out to be not the case, even when we accounted for gender norms. In general, the men were far less willing to share their intimate feelings with their partner. And, historically, men are less willing to share their intimate feelings with their partner. But here again, it was quite glaring. In non-standard unions, it was 14% of the men were willing to share their feelings, whereas in formal marriages, 35%. So that's a huge, almost 33, three times almost there. Now, the question we had was what accounts for this men of lack of trust in the relationship? It might indicate that the men's lack of trust is related to their durability of the relationship, or their lack of trust in the relationship, or other factors we don't know, and we need to investigate that more. Which brought us to rates of infidelity. We wanted to know what are the rates of infidelity for men and women in these unions. Women, it seems, show their mistrust of their male partner in a different way. Rates of infidelity for women in non-standard marriages was higher, that's 7%, than those in formal marriages. So, for men, it showed itself more by not sharing intimate thoughts. For women, it showed by rates of infidelity in non-standard marriages. But the men in formal marriage, interestingly enough, cheated more, about 9%, than those in non-standard marriages, which was about 6%. Now, the difference isn't large, but statistically it's significant. What is the reason? It may be that ease with which men could leave a non-standard marriage reduced their interest in cheating on their partner. As a whole, I should say, rates of marital infidelity in our SWANA sample for both types of union was far less than what it is for the United States, which is about 25%. We wanted to know if these unions are long-term or the couple expected to be. And here again was a huge difference. 36% of the women expected these non-traditional unions to last their whole life, whereas only 17% of the men had the same expectation. So this is pretty dramatic again, more than twice. Finally, we wanted to know if there was a correlation between education and engaging in Urfi marriages. And what we saw was that the tendency was for the less educated, and I would say more men from the more pious classes, to be in such marriages. So about 30% of the men in our sample who were in an Urfi marriage had a primary education or less, but only about 15% of women in our survey who were in an Urfi marriage had a primary education or less. So women, again, are less reluctant to enter these unions. And the others were actually much smaller percentages divided based on, whether they had more of a primary education. So we could actually look and see whether they had a middle school education, a high school education, how many years of college, and so forth. So what we see is that Urfi marriages are more common among people with low education, which also probably means low income. In conclusion, we see that non-standard marriages are on the rise in the region, that this cannot just be attributed to the rise of Islamist discourses. In fact, the opposite might be the case. What we're arguing is that Islamist discourses that support non-standard marriages might have gained more popularity because of the serious social and economic reasons that have made standard marriages prohibitive. The growing interest in non-standard marriages and the fact that Islamist organizations now recognize these as legitimate unions might have actually contributed to the greater popularity of the Islamist movements, which are also providing new venues for matchmaking and finding of compatible spouses. So we were actually reversing the understanding that Islamism is actually responding to a need, desperate need in the region, rather than being the cause of it, and therefore its popularity. In parts of the region, given the high rate of male support for the practice, the choice for women has increasingly become either a non-standard marriage or no marriage at all. So it's not a question of, a woman holding on for a standard marriage, because that actually may not even be the option for them in many regions. Here we would argue that registration of such marriages by the state might at least assure the paternity of a child born out of this union and provide the wife with some child support when the union breaks up. Western-style cohabitation, instead of Urfi or Mutta, are instead growing among more secular and more educated populations. And we see that in Iran and Tunisia. And we see this among more previously married individuals. These are primarily individuals who not either intend to have children or they wish to delay having children. So the institution of marriage going through dramatic changes in the region, and we anticipated to become an even more explosive issue in the decade to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for this fascinating lecture, Janet, and for the research actually you and Professor Friedland conducted. As we are waiting for questions to come in, I wonder if you can tell us more about the white marriages in Iran and whether or not you saw similar trends in the SWANA.
So white marriages are, some of the participants in our volume actually talk in detail. Maserat Amir Ibrahimi, who lives in Iran, for example, has an article in our volume, upcoming volume. These are happening between, and she gives some stories, so it's a young woman who comes to Tehran to go to the university. First, she goes to the dormitory. In a few years, she and a few friends get an apartment together. In the process, she finds a boyfriend, then she gets a job in the process. And then what she does, she goes into one of the high rises and she gets an apartment there, or maybe they get an apartment together. It's unclear. Probably she pays for it, or maybe they share it. And then they usually use two different doors to come inside and outside. So they prefer to live in these large settings, high rises and building complexes where it's not so obvious. And of course, they, that nobody would really pry into their personal lives. It also happens among, in a lot of Iranian families. The family has used to have a house 40 years ago and have demolished that and built, 5 stories, and each member of the family lives in an apartment. So there you actually have some protection because the main protection is the government intrusion. These institutions, any kind of a relationship out of marriage, out of mutta or formal marriage, is considered illegal by the state and is actually punishable, and punishable fiercely. But what's happened in recent years is that first the government sort of opposed it, then finally they got to the point where they denied it, and finally they've just thrown up their hands and they're not really doing anything about it, provided you're careful about the relationship. In Tunisia, it's more easier because it's not enforced by the state. So we see it in countries in the Middle East where the more secular people don't even bother with something like Urfi or Mut'a, even though the institution is available to them because of the stigma that is attached to it, because it's seen as an opportunity simply for a man to have a sex. And they find that cohabitation, which in Iran they call white marriage, is a more dignified way of living with a partner. Hope I answered your question.
Thank you so much. So we have a question from Facebook asking whether or not you believe the economic reasons are cause for increase of these unions.
So as I said, we show in our paper, economic reasons is a huge part of it. Wars are a huge part of it, and dislocation of people. Vast rates of migration, out migration again because of economic reasons. So that's part of the reason. And the other part of it is that people are just delaying marriages. So, used to have girls getting married 17, 18 in Iran about 40 years ago. And now everybody who can would delay marriage. And when they delay marriage, so of course you have these years and then you have to work, you want to work so that you would save some for when you actually do get married. And so you have essentially a good chunk of your life, 10, 15 years where you're not married. And so, it seems like a reasonable way of thinking about a relationship when you're not ready to be in a formal marriage also.
Thank you. Another question is asking, were you able to compare rural versus urban men and women?
Yes, our sample includes rural populations as well as urban populations. In the rural community, we talk about this a bit more in the book that we're publishing with Jesslyn. What's happening in the rural community is that the option of a white marriage, although they wistfully talk about it, rural women, that they wish something like this would have been available to them and their father and brother would have not complained about it, that is not an option to them. So here, the only option that remains is going through a sigha or mut'a union. But as I said, a study that Akbar Aghajanian has done in Kermanshah shows that, and Kermanshah is a conservative part of Iran, just sort of to bring that up. It shows that even there, what's happening is that people are not doing white marriages, but mut'a is changing. It's becoming actually more like a more modern kind of relationship because people are entering it much later. So you don't have the situation of a 45-year-old man marrying a 13-year-old girl. You have, I'm not saying child marriage isn't there, but it's very, very small, the rates of child marriage. But it's people in their 30s and 40s. And many of them, these are relationships. They're not short-term relationships like before. They could last the average, I believe, mean year was 9 years for that one study that was done. So again, even then, the meaning of the term mut'a and sigha is actually changing. The practice of it is changing.
Mm-hmm. We have a question asking why you think the rates of infidelity are so much higher in the US.
I'm not a specialist on that. I'm not to answer that question to you. Raja would probably be a better person. I'm happy if you send your questions, I'll send it to him because he has actually worked on, his expertise is sexual relationships in the US. And mine was being a historian of the Middle East. And we started working on this project together.
Thank you. So another one, for the people who enter these non-standard unions that you mentioned, is it always by choice or some people are forced into these unions?
So that's the category we did not, we deliberately bracketed out. I mentioned briefly that we see a lot of what's known as misyar happening in Egypt. So they're really appalling because you have a situation where a young girl of 15 or 17 might have actually been in like 30 of these misyar unions, which is basically a sex trade. But if the family knows about it, it's a way for them to make a living. Otherwise, they'll be absolutely impoverished, I believe. And so they're using their daughter basically for sex trade. So in that case, I would say it's not a voluntary union at all. But we bracketed out that category. We included categories of people who said they voluntarily entered these unions and they were adults. Mm-hmm. And that would be an entirely different project.
Thank you. The next question has two parts. So the first part is asking what was the rationale in picking the countries you chose? So let's say, why not Lebanon or any of the Gulf countries? Mm-hmm. And the second part of the question is asking were these forms of non-standard marriages often taking place concurrently with standard marriages?
Right. So the answer to the first question is that we tried, because we did also a qualitative study on the side of these quantitative studies. And so we did it based on students we also had at UCSB who could or researchers we had in the region who could provide us with additional information about the region. We would very much like to expand the study to places like Lebanon and countries that we actually have not studied yet. And the second part was the question was what?
Were standard and non-standard marriages taking place concurrently?
Right. So we had to exclude that because it became so complicated. If someone was already in a formal marriage and they were also in a temporary marriage, then keeping track of these two strands was just beyond our capacity, basically our quantitative abilities at the time we did the studies. So we made a definite decision to exclude that. And that's why I said that we made sure that people we're studying were not in a formal marriage. But that's again something we'd like to do in the future.
Thank you. Someone is thanking you for the discourse and saying they might have missed this, but they're curious if most of the couples engaging in these non-standard marriages are older, or do they tend to be younger? And do you think there would be an increase in interest for these non-standard marriages for young Muslims in the West?
So the answer to the first part is that our survey takers were between 20 and 41. So I would imagine this would be considered, they're not for legal reasons, we couldn't even survey under 18. But the majority are in our 20s and 30s, essentially, in our study. So they're not very young, they're not like they could have been 18 or 19, but they're not. They're actually in their 20s and 30s. And the second question was?
Do you think there would be an increase for these unions in the West?
That is actually happening, right? In the Pakistani diaspora community, young people are actually turning to their parents and saying, well, I'm not dating, this is an Urfi marriage, And so they're using these legal means to argue that they can be in an Urfi union when their parents, of course, completely disapprove, So yes, it's actually growing in popularity in diaspora communities.
Thank you. Next question, do you think there is a possibility that the economic problems will push for less expensive wedding and post-marriage living of the couple?
Yeah, so we have to think about what is the reason and rationale for the expensive wedding and also for the mahriya and these other things. We don't have community property in the Middle East, in most of the Middle East. I don't think Turkey might have some version of it, but for the majority of the Middle East, we don't have it. And that's the property that a husband and wife accumulate in the course of their marriage. Because in most marriages, women take off from work for a few years, sometimes more, to raise children. Community property is extremely important. Now, in vast majority of cases, what the man makes is the man's, even though they're in a marriage together. So the woman's family feels that they need to have a lot of protections for this marriage. The expensive marriage, wedding ceremony, is a way to essentially obligate the man to not kind of do this again, sort of like you've spent all this money, you better stay in the relationship. And it's also the requirements of the high mahriya, which is an amount the man has to pay in case of a divorce or death of a husband to his wife. These are all requirements, or for example, the requirement in many areas now that the husband provide and his family provide a house, a living, an apartment, something. These are all because there's no security in the institution of marriage. So what we need are laws that would provide security to the wife in the course of her marriage and any money that's accumulated in the course of their living together, even if she has to stay home and he goes out and makes the money, which is, as I showed you in the sample, is actually not the case. A lot of women are working now. Until you do that, until those laws change, parents are going to insist on these things for their daughter. And I don't think you could just wish it, like clerics in every religion always tell people, don't have weddings and don't make weddings so expensive. But they don't talk about, well, what is the protection for a woman, therefore, in a marriage? And I think the laws have to be changed ostensibly before you see the traditions. I mean, some people might still do it because they want to and they have the money, but I don't think it will become that essential as it is now.
Thank you. As a follow-up, even though I think you might have answered the question, do some couples do the aqd, then live together before the wedding celebration as a way of putting off the expense of wedding and post-marriage housing?
So that is an old tradition that goes back all the way to the 19th century, where you would enter the aqd and then you wouldn't have the wedding ceremony. But it was assumed that you may or may not have sex in this period, and it was kind of okay, although the family wouldn't publicize it. And then, so you would have the aqd as a way of making sure the family wanted, the girl's family really wanted that, so that when they put them together, they wouldn't get worried about her getting pregnant or losing her virginity before then. And then they would get married. So that's a very, very old tradition. And that, of course, continues, yes.
Thank you. Next question. Thank you so much for this interesting research. Given that these couples share a household in these non-traditional marriages and carry the costs, and a good number of women are employed, as you said, 44%, and very few dependent economically on the relationship, according to your survey, and that a large number of participants believe these marriages should be illegal, it's a little difficult to understand why people are actually engaging in this kind of, unions to this context. Could you speak to this discrepancy?
Yeah, I think some of the people who say it should be illegal want to have actually some legal protections for it. In other words, they think the way the union is as such should be illegal because they find that there offers no protection to women. But many of the people who say it should be illegal are also people who want it to be made legal in some form. But as you saw in our sample, there's a great deal of unassurance. I mean, this is not a topic that's discussed on radio and TV all the time for people to express their views of it. Society has changed. People are delaying marriage. There's a need for sexual intimacy in the years before you get married or even in place of marriage. And yet this conversation is not out there. And it needs to be out there before we can sort this out. To what extent people disapprove of the marriage because it offers no protection, to what extent they wanted to perhaps offer some protection for the woman in case of separation, and particularly in case of paternity of any children.
Right, thank you. Thank you so much for this fascinating talk. It seems that there is a negative correlation between an increase in the age of marriage and their success, whether in education, in the job market, or in politics. What is your take on this relationship?
I mean, you have to think about the fact that traditionally women have been there basically as helpers to men. And that mindset hasn't died out. So families want a girl to brought in young, to mold her to her liking. The husband wants that, the mother-in-law wants that. And so as the woman gets older, her malleability, if you will, becomes less. She has more of a say. And this is a reason why people still, to some extent, families particularly, prefer that their son marries somebody who is younger. I think this will change as women become more employed and their financial power becomes more clear. So as men's earning power has lessened, but their expectation as men hasn't changed that much yet, right? So if you get to a point where finally becomes clear that if you marry a woman who has more education and has a good job, you actually can get that condo that you wanted to get. You don't have to just all do it on your own. That if you lose a job, she's there and she has health insurance that could provide you with insurance in the case of, you're getting ill or something like that. Or that if something happens to the man, the wife makes enough or has enough earning potential for him to stay home and for her to work and provide for the children. So these are all the great benefits of having a wife who is working and more educated and has great working potential. That hasn't quite sipped in. See, it's going to take a few years and decades before that finally becomes more clear.
Thank you. Another question, does the increase of the number of never married women entering a mota' marriage mean the recent decrease of the value of virginity in Iranian culture?
So yeah, the joke on the street, of course, when I was in Tehran last was that there are no virgins left anymore, basically. That's partly because premarital sex is getting quite common in the secular sector of society, and maybe even in the non-secular sector quietly. Forms of hymen repair operations I've actually written about this in my sexual politics book. We find examples of that in the 19th century, probably sooner, and they're still there. And of course, more technology is available for that. The problem is that why isn't a guy who's having sex with his girlfriend thinking any less of her and thinking that he should marry somebody who's virgin? So it's a mindset of the men that has to change rather than the women. And until that changes, the women have to go through this charade, basically, of they date someone, if the relationship works out and the guy is open-minded enough, they marry. And if he's not, and she has to now revert back to having a more traditional marriage, then she has to go through a hymen repair operation.
Thank you. I find it very interesting that rates of infidelity among non-traditional marriages were lower than that of traditional marriages, yet at the same time, the men in non-traditional marriages overwhelmingly viewed their relationship as short-term. Why do you think this is?
Yeah, I think the two are connected. So as long as you're in the relationship, because it's so easy to leave it, you don't really feel a need for infidelity. You're in this relationship with this woman. You understand that if you don't like her, for any reason you leave her, you leave her. So why bother going through all the, secrecy of having another affair, right? Whereas in marriages, formal marriage is different. You're married to someone, you have all these family obligations, you leave it, you have to pay a substantial amount of mahriya. The divorce process is a very difficult one. So that probably increases the tendency of wanting to have an affair, secret affair, rather than actually getting a divorce.
Thank you. Do you think the increase of the average age of women when they are ready to marry will eventually destigmatize getting married at an older age?
Absolutely, it's already happened. Yeah, it's already happening very much. And I think that is connected, though, to the financial power of the woman. In other words, just being older isn't going to be an attractive factor in the marriage market. It's the financial ability of the woman that ultimately is going to be a very important factor in making her a more desirable marriage partner.
For white marriages in Iran, what does fierce punishment by the state look like? Do you know of any recent cases that were punished by the state?
Actually, we don't, but I'm not there to know the latest figures, but all our researchers who are inside Iran don't refer to that. They simply say that the government is looking the other way. And that doesn't mean that it's not happening. It may be cases where it is actually happening, but it certainly hasn't made it to the newspapers in a big way. Of course, people are also careful. So I would call it more in the manner of Bill Clinton, a don't ask, don't tell kind of thing with the gay rights movement in America, in which it's taking place. We don't ask any question and you don't advertise it.
So there's another question which seems like a follow-up one. Why do you think the government tolerates white marriages in terms of not persecuting the offenders, while the seemingly less serious hijab violators are treated as more serious offenders?
I think hijab is in your face. If you take your veil off and you walk in the streets with your bare hair, then everybody has seen. Whereas a white marriage is quiet. Two people are living together. It's not made public. And therefore, the government doesn't have to be that worried about it. But even on the veil, just yesterday, BBC had some people who are, hardcore Islamists in the government are now speaking against the mandatory veil. And I think it's the pressure of their children and their grandchildren, granddaughters, I should say, grandchildren, who is making it essential that the government re-examine the whole question.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Afary, for your great talk. I am wondering if you have something to say about dynamics between young Iranians and their parents with regard to non-standard marriages, whether modern or traditional non-standard. I'm curious to know what facilitating as opposed to prevailing roles parents play with regard to their youth's non-standard marriages.
So of course, this depends from family to family. Some families are completely unaccepting. And in our book, we show where couples who are in such unions complain that when they go to family events, the wedding, for example, or holiday, they have to go alone and they don't take their partner with them. And this, by the way, was the case, has been the case in diaspora too. People are in long-term relationships, but they don't take their partner to these family events because even though your parents, your immediate family might be more agreeing, it's your aunts and cousins and grandmothers and so forth. And, there's talk of the family. And so you can't afford to make it that public, I think.
Thank you. Do any of the couples have children? And if so, what happens to the children?
So this is the sticking issue. Our understanding of white marriages Professor Vatan Dost, actually from Kuwait American University, has a really interesting article about this in our volume, is that it's with the understanding that they're not going to have children. So it doesn't mean that they will never have children. It's, in many cases, it's either a sort of a experimental thing. We're going to live together. We're going to see how it works out. And then either the relationship breaks up, or if they decide to have children, they will get married. Or it could be, in majority of cases, people who have actually been married before. Maybe they have children, maybe they don't have children. And anyway, they don't have the intention of having a child in these unions. Because as it stands in the current situation, if you do have a child, then the government asks for who is the father of this child, and then they would ask for a marriage certificate, and you have to produce those two, and you can't do that when you're in a white union.
Thank you. In the beginning, you made a note of specific types of unions you were excluding in your study. Does that situate your participants in each of the participant countries and the diasporas within a specific social class?
No, we had people from all social classes, provided they were Facebook users. But you'd be surprised how many people with primary education are Facebook users, and how many people who are manual workers are also Facebook users. So Facebook is no longer, I don't think is an elite institution or a media. So in that sense, it's actually where our sample was relatively representative of various social categories.
Thank you. What relationship, if any, existed between responses from the diaspora and home countries? Were there profound differences?
One of our studies in the book that we published compared the attitude of, again, it was by Dr. Vatan Dost and his colleague looked at the Canadian American community and the Iranian American community with regard to attitudes about mut'a or sigha. And there wasn't a huge difference actually between the two. It was basically that they both are worried about the insecurity of the institution and raise that question. But he was actually quite surprised. He and his colleagues were actually quite surprised that there wasn't such a huge difference. Where the difference is in rural communities where women may either disapprove of it or may wish to do it, but of course the community is far more traditional to allow something like this to happen.
Can a non-standard marriage ever eventually lead to a standard marriage?
Wouldn't lead necessarily. They would have to go and enter into a nikah, formal marriage. Yes, and it does. But as we saw in our survey, and probably the most disturbing thing to us was the percentage of men who thought that this was going to be this would not last their whole life. I mean, 17% of men compared to 35% of women. So I think women need to be aware of, not that they shouldn't enter these relationships, obviously there's a need for it, that they should provide themselves with a lot of protection. They shouldn't think that that's just because it's a marriage. First of all, it is a marriage. They should know that it could break up. They should be sure to financially maintain themselves independent. They should be wary of having a child without, without basically entering into a formal marriage for the time being when the situation is such. And I would say they should be careful with financial collaborations also, because as far as we know, the men are far less committed to it than the women are.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Afary, for a great presentation. I have a question about mut'a and white marriages. As mut'a doesn't need to be registered or documented, the white marriage can basically be a mut'a in a way. So why is government so against it?
Mut'a is registered now. In the old days, 19th century, early 20th century, it didn't have to be registered, but now it has to be registered. It's a good question. In other words, if you have the option of something called mut'a in your culture, in your religion and your laws, why then do something called, basically cohabitation? And the answer is it's a political statement, I think. There are two things really here. One is that the Iranian community, regardless of what the religious law has said or what the law has said since the institution of Islamic Republic, has always had a very disdainful attitude towards mut'a or sigha, particularly the woman in this relationship. So a professional woman wouldn't like to call herself a sigha of a man. This would be demeaning to her. And so therefore, so that's partly that. And partly I think it's political, it's a way of expressing their dissent towards the laws of the country.
How do the children from these unions react to their parents?
So as I said, in Egypt, we have a number of cases where in the Sunni countries, actually, I would say it's a bigger problem because the institution is new and a lot of women are unaware of the non-existent rights that they have. In Egypt, they finally passed the law where children of these unions were recognized by the state, the paternity was recognized, but you have to come up with a lot of documentation because you don't have the formal marriage certificate. So you have to come up with witnesses who saw you and, bank receipts and shared expenses and things like that. You have to go through a lot of work, get a lawyer to then be able to prove the paternity of a man. But the law is not there. And it seems to be a transition in many countries of gradually recognizing at least the paternity of a child. And that's important both for, registering the kid in school where they ask for who the father of the child is, but also for child support. If the man is in a position where he can support his kid, well, then he should be able to do so, and the law should be able to go after him. So I think more and more countries, as the institution is getting more popular are realizing that there have to be some legislation to actually recognize it in some form.
Thank you. And the final question of the day, when an ordinary marriage falls apart, women suffer more because a divorced woman is generally considered less desirable. Is there a similar effect in white marriages, or is their secrecy a form of protection for the women involved?
Yeah, that's a good question, actually. So yes, there's a great deal of stigma. And one that I've never understood is that a woman who is divorced, her family, the idea that she would marry someone who's never married before, a man who's never married before, that the family is completely unaccepting, and the men themselves are also unaccepting. And I've talked about this in detail about, why this mindset. I would say that yes, that a white marriage does provide, a white union, I would call it, does provide some secrecy, some protection. Therefore, it may be that your next boyfriend is aware of the fact that you were in such a union before, but at least his family doesn't know. And that's really all that matters in terms of how you introduce your spouse, your fiance now to your family.
Thank you so much, Dr. Afary. This was
great. For the
wonderful
questions, by the way.
We
and
had
any others that you would like us to address, or any questions, we're always interested in hearing from you. You can write to me. You can find me easily on web, Janet Afary, and me and my colleague, Roger Friedland, I'm sorry he couldn't be with us today, are happy to answer your questions.
Thanks to our participants and the lively discussions we had. You answered over 20 questions in this short time. I want to thank everyone for joining us today and remind you not to forget next week's panel. We're going to have 3 fascinating papers next week as well. So until next week, thank you for joining us and goodbye.
Thank you very much.